If you go to the highlands of the Andes Mountains today and browse the fields and the markets, you'll notice an interesting pattern. This land was a hotbed for ancient civilizations developing all kinds of plants for food, but there seems a bias towards plants like this. Plants who survive the erratic climate and cool, dry seasons by storing their nutrients in tubers or roots underground. Here in the Andes, many plants from many different families did this, and through the millennia, people worked and molded them into vegetables that would sustain a population. Well, a couple of these have since become amongst the world's most eaten crops. Most have not. Here we'll look at 5 of these less known crops, some more standard tasting, some more distinctive, to put it mildly, plus a fruit thrown in for good measure. But why not start with one of the stranger root crops, a sunflower relative with a root that tastes more like a fruit, but isn't really digestible. My second favorite on this list, jacón. So when I say non-digestible, I don't mean that this is poisonous or something like that. Far from it. More just that, well, when you eat it, most of it just passes right through your digestive system without even giving you many calories, which might seem odd, given just how sweet these can be. So sweet, in fact, that they've been given names like strawberry jicama or apple of the earth. I mean, to be fair, that last name is also the French name for the potato, but here at least it actually makes more sense. Less sweet jacons can be used in a savory context, but the sweeter ones, the sweetness makes it one of the rare examples of something that is not botanically a fruit, but in culinary terms, you could call it a fruit and use it as a fruit, and many in the Andes do. It feels strange eating a root crop that way, but you can eat it raw or cooked. Raw, it's kind of, well, the one I had, it tasted somewhere between an apple and a pear, with a texture maybe more like an Asian pear, or a really crunchy apple. I also noticed a hint of maybe caramel or sugarcane or dark honey or something in that ballpark. Other jacons, though, apparently can taste a bit more like watermelon or strawberry, though. Unsurprisingly, these often get juiced. That juice can then be used to flavor other drinks or made into a syrup. It gets used in confections, pastries. They can be baked or boiled, made into chips, ground into a sweet flour. Now, you might wonder, though, being sweet and fruity tasting like this, how could this just be a low-calorie thing that mostly passes right through? Does it not contain lots of sugars? Isn't that the biological purpose of a lot of these root vegetables? An opportunity for the plant to store its sugars? Well, yes, but many root vegetables, including most on this list, are high in starch, which is a polysaccharide, meaning a chain of many smaller units of sugars. In starch's case, glucose. Glucose is very sweet, but chained together in a starch like that, it's the wrong shape to activate the sweet taste receptors in our mouths, so it doesn't taste sweet. But our bodies produce an enzyme called amylase. It's present in our spit, and it breaks down the starch into smaller sugar chains and plain glucose units, so our bodies can use it for calories. Now, glucose is not the only sugar that can form these chains, though. Fructose is another sweet, simple sugar we use for calories, found in many fruits, hence the fruct in its name. If you make a long chain of fructose, instead of starch you get inulin, also not sweet. But a shorter chain will get you fructooligosaccharides, or FOS for short. This is how jacón stores most of its sugars, and those FOS do activate our sweet taste buds. They taste sweet. But unlike starch, our bodies don't have an enzyme to break these down, so they end up making it most of the way through the digestive tract intact. It's only when they get to the large intestine that bacteria in the gut start to feed on them and ferment them and release a little bit back to our bodies as energy. So most of the FOS end up either feeding our gut flora or passing right on through as a dietary fiber. Thus, in the end, jacón here is sweet, but unless you store or process it in certain ways to break down those FOS, it provides very few calories. Now, this is both a pro and a con. People in the modern West probably immediately see the pro side. It seems like a good sweetener for people with diabetes or people just trying to watch their calorie intake. This and the fact that it could provide an unusually plentiful and pure source of fructose have some people interested in spreading it around as a crop. Like most of the plants on this list, being from the high mountains, Jacone can handle cold, windy conditions and poor soil, but unlike many of the other Andean crops, it doesn't seem to have any sensitivity to day length, meaning, unlike the others, which will get confused by long summer days if planted far from the equator and won't start producing tubers till autumn when the days get shorter again, unlike those, Jacone here will do just fine, regardless of the day length. And so this has spread some to parts of East and Southeast Asia, the southern states, Europe, Brazil, Australia, and, like every Andean crop it seems, New Zealand. So big appeal today, but the whole low-calorie aspect does put this in an interesting place historically. Today, lots of people will go bananas for a natural low-calorie food. But talk to your average Andean farmer in 600 AD, and preventing obesity is probably not their biggest concern. A bigger concern would be preventing starvation and malnutrition. And that's the downside of a low-calorie crop. You can't really use it for sustenance. This obviously couldn't be a staple calorie source for people in the Andes. Yet it was quite popular. It shows up in tombs over quite a wide area well before the Inca, and the Moche people, as always, made pottery shaped after it. So why was it so widespread? Well, a number of reasons. First, it's worth bearing in mind that farmers were seldom growing just one crop. Often they would have several of these crops from this list all mixed together in their field and then separate them after harvest. Doing that, even if one or a few of the species failed to produce that year, they would have others, and they're not just left with a low-calorie food. Also, though, these plants have good high-protein leaves and stems, sometimes used as human food, but also good for grazing animals, and many of those animals can also digest the FOS in these roots. Also, beyond food, these had a number of traditional medicinal uses, including actually treating people with diabetes. And to top it off, these were usually ripe in the drier months, so even without many calories, having a nice juicy treat to help fight off dehydration, that could still be pretty useful. And, of course, regardless of nutritional value, even poor, starving farmers like nice things. Most of the following crops will be more staple crops, but it is interesting looking at non-staple ones like this. So if you're looking for more standard tasting but colorful root vegetables, the next two might be more what you're looking for. Stranger ones will follow after that. So I mentioned that a lot of Andean crops seem to grow pretty well in New Zealand. Well, here, the Kiwis even took it a step further, and despite this being one of the oldest Andean crops, grown from Ecuador all the way down to mid-southern Chile, found in tombs and artistic depictions long into the distant past there, New Zealand swooped in and even tried to steal its identity by renaming these New Zealand yams. Oh, marketing. A more traditional name for these, though, is oca. These are peculiar looking things. They kind of look like an exceptionally knobbly and colorful potato. But potatoes, they are not. Not even the same family. None on this list are. Nor are they true yams. Foragers and gardeners might recognize this as part of the oxalis family, the wood sorrels, these plants that look like they're pretending to be clovers. And just like some of its relatives, oca's leaves and stems have that intensely tangy flavor like sorrel or mild rhubarb. But it isn't mainly grown for its leaves, it's grown for its tubers. How do they taste? Well, it varies quite a bit. Some you can eat straight raw, some you can't. Many of them are bitter or sour from oxalic acid and need either cooking or leaving out in the sun to tame that down. The one I tasted when I tried it raw had a very mild flavor, a hint of the taste of white flour, a slight tang, a faint sweetness, a careless whisper of something green and vegetable-y. Used raw, you can pickle them, put them in salads, candy them. In Mexico, where they've spread in recent centuries, they eat them with salt, lemon, and chili peppers. Some of the more bitter ones, though, might traditionally get freeze-dried and made into a product similar to chuño, which is more often made with bitter potatoes. See this video for more on that. Cooked, you can use them a lot like potatoes. Some have marketed them as being like potatoes that don't need sour cream due to already having some tang in them. The one I had, the tang disappeared on cooking, and it tasted a lot actually like a slightly sweeter than usual potato. But again, they vary a lot. And you can make them steamed, baked, roasted, fried, ground into flour for porridges and desserts. In terms of nutrients, oca is often as good or even better than potatoes. Good calcium, iron, protein, fiber, very high in antioxidants, higher in some even than blackberries and blueberries. Some suggest this could be a good crop to spread to warmer temperate areas and cooler tropical highlands. And interestingly, some places actually already have it without realizing it, particularly some parts of Europe where it's present as an ornamental, but people, if they see it, just don't tend to realize that it's actually edible. Also, it's easy to propagate and grow. I mean, they do have that pesky day length sensitivity, but some varieties do grow fairly far south in the Andes, where the summer days are a little bit longer, so those might be worth investigating more. And it's actually thought those are where New Zealand's oca came from, and those at least seem less sensitive to day length. I mean, looking at iNaturalist, they apparently grow at least as far south as Dunedin, though whether they produce good crops that far south, I don't know for sure. In any case, some definite promise as a crop there. Speaking of New Zealand, though, the Kiwis struck again and decided to rename this next one as well. I mean, I can't blame them here as much. The Spanish name is kind of hard to say as an English speaker, but not content with just anglicizing the name, they instead chose quaintness and renamed them Earth Gems. I can kind of see why, just looking at them, and some of them do get quite brightly colored. They weren't the first to see them as valuable, in a sense. Behind the potato, this is the next most popular root crop in the Andes, and it's been described as one of the few indigenous crops to have been enthusiastically accepted by those of Hispanic descent. You can find them all over the highland markets in Peru, and they're known there as ojuco, or papalisa, meaning smooth potato. Now, even though they look pretty potato-like from the outside, one might even say like a very smooth potato, again, they are definitely not a potato. They're in the same family as Malabar spinach, this vining plant with edible leaves that people sometimes grow here in the north as an edible ornamental. Like those, these have succulent, edible leaves that produce goopy mucilage. The tubers have a bit of mucilage too, but it's a lot more subtle than in the leaves. But these smooth tubers, the smoothness isn't just in the skin. These have an interesting texture too. It varies from plant to plant, but when I tasted it raw, it was quite crunchy, not much flavor, though I tasted it right after one of the later ones in this list, so my taste buds may have been a bit numbed from that. But it made me think of maybe like a very mild water chestnut. Reportedly, some of them can keep their crunch even when cooked or canned, like this one is one of the few I could actually find again here in Canada. This one did not keep its crunch, so your mileage may vary. That tastes very much like a cooked one. The one I boiled got sort of a silky, soft texture with just a hint of firmness. The closest I can think of would be like Celtis or lettuce stems, or maybe like onions that have been sauteed until translucent but not browning at all. That sort of texture, and it didn't really mush down the way potatoes do. And yeah, canned, very, very similar. Some apparently even get a bit gummy. The flavor cooked made me think of like potatoes with a hint of green bean. Very tasty with butter and salt. And it's a nice bonus knowing for a root vegetable, these are also quite high in vitamin C. Now, compared to a potato, these are not really a frying vegetable. It's more watery, less starchy, but for other uses, it can work as good or better. That smoothness and little bit of mucilage means it can be used to thicken soups, stews, or hot sauces. It can be pickled, put in salads, raw, or cooked. These don't typically store for long, but if you do want a longer lasting, stronger flavored version of this, they do also freeze dry this one. Ojuko has started spreading more around the world a bit. It's nice looking, nice tasting, similarly adapted to a wide array of growing conditions from Colombia all the way down to Argentina, though not so much the lowland tropical heat. The whole day length sensitivity is, again, a limiting factor, but there have been successful growings in a field in England, apparently, and then, of course, New Zealand. Anyway, earth gems, definitely not a bad vegetable. I wish I could say that with the same conviction about this next one, but here we go. I hope this section doesn't get the video demonetized. Okay, maca. If you've heard of one of the plants on this list, it's probably this one, which is kind of funny considering only a few decades ago this was declared to be in danger of extinction and unlikely to be of interest to the wider world outside the Andes. Way back in history, it was widely grown all the way from Ecuador down to Argentina. Remains have been found at sites dated back to 1600 BC. It was a highly prized plant, and after the time of the Spanish conquest, it was even used as an item to pay taxes to the Spanish. From there, however, its popularity waned, and it came to be seen as a poor person's food and too complicated to grow, before returning in recent years, creating a name for itself internationally in the natural supplements and medicines market. You can find it in some pharmacies, health food stores. I think even Bulk Barn had it at one point. But less known is that in Peru and Bolivia, in the relatively tiny area it's grown in, it's also actually used as a vegetable. Or actually, two vegetables. You've got the root, or tuberous hypocotyl if you want to get all fancy and technical. Same plant part actually as a turnip, which is in the same family. And less known, it also provides a leaf vegetable with a spicy flavor, kind of like cress, also in the same family. Now, why would this be a valuable vegetable specifically? Well, it's a textbook case of low supply, high demand. For low supply, this is a very specialized plant. Most of the plants I've mentioned have been well adapted to the high mountains, but even more so than any of them, more so than tarwi in my previous video, and even more than the bitter potatoes mentioned in the one before that. This is a plant of the high mountain tundra. One source I read described it as possibly the only crop in the world capable of growing at such extreme elevations. There is one that may compete for that title, but that's another video. So on the one hand, yes, this is an incredibly resilient plant. It's great at handling the harsh, inhospitable conditions that you find up in the mountains, but it's so specialized for that it doesn't grow well further down the mountains, doesn't like the heat. And even up there, it's a bit of a prima donna when it comes to growing. It's not an easy crop to grow. First, it drains the soil of nutrients so much that these were often only planted again in the same field on a 10-year rotation. That is, 1 year growing maca, 9 years letting the soil rest. And second, the seeds are finicky at sprouting and kind of tedious to produce. Traditionally, to get seeds, the roots would be left at the end of the growing season to go dormant. Then they'd be dug up and transplanted to a new location, and the next growing season they would produce seeds, which would be allowed to fall into the soil. And the seedy soil would then be spread around to produce more. It's a fair bit of work. But despite all that, people did think it well worth the effort to produce it. So the biggest reason for its demand today, which links to part of its demand in the past, comes from its purported health effects. This traditionally had many medicinal uses, but the most famous one and the biggest marketing point for it today, how do I word this so as not to get demonetized? It gets used for increasing one's baby-making abilities, including doing so as the body slows down in middle age, romantic desire, and fertility. But a few studies have found improved male fertility, desire, and romantic ability for men and women. Additionally, though, it's also shown some positive effects on immune system function, memory, fatigue, and also it's being looked at as an alternative for hormone replacement therapy for reducing the effects of menopause. Now, that said, as far as I could find, most of the studies done so far have been fairly small scale with small sample sizes, so it's hard to base too much on those findings yet. And hopefully larger scale research will be done to verify those findings. And there are some caveats as well. Some have noted a potentially harmful chemical called MTCA in maca, but studies figure it's probably not a worry in maca's case, especially when boiled. One study also noted maca may have ill effects on women with endometriosis, and that for supplements and such things, there can be wide variation in quality control. To return to the fertility part for a moment, though, that is actually part of why the Spanish valued it when they came and accepted it as taxes. During and after the Spanish conquest, the Spanish noticed that their livestock were reproducing a lot less in the highlands. So they asked the locals about this, and the locals recommended feeding the animals maca. They tried it, and the chroniclers at least saw it as a success, with a general increase in the animals' vitality and fertility. And so they began feeding it to a bunch of their livestock, their horses, and even their soldiers to increase their energy, where working at such high elevations can be exhausting if you're not used to it. At least that's the reason they gave. Now, it's partially unclear how much of that was because of the medicinal effects and how much was because maca had a lot of nutrients that were otherwise deficient in their diets. It's kind of hard to say. It is a pretty nutritious crop, especially taking into account how limited your options are at these heights. Nutrients vary from variety to variety, but generally at least it's got appreciable protein, starches, sugars, minerals, including iron and iodine, which are more often lacking in highland diets, and it stores well for a few years if you dry it. And let me tell you, if you do get the whole roots dried, they're kind of like a block of wood. And I basically had to saw one of these into pieces to make tea from it. Smaller ones are apparently less tough and fibrous, but do bear that in mind if you plan to grind them or cut them up. Now, if you do manage to find them fresh, they can be used as a vegetable, often baked or sometimes roasted in ashes. Dried, as you'll more likely find them, the most common use is probably to use it as a coffee or tea sort of drink, but they can be boiled to make puddings, porridges, even jams in certain regions, fermented into an alcoholic drink, ground into flour for cookies. I did see a reference to it being used in a mayo-based sauce as well, which I am intrigued by, but slightly wary of. So you may be wondering at this point what this tastes like, and that is a great question. This is one of those times when the things that I've read do not match with my experience. Limited experiences, granted. And it makes me wonder if there's just something weird with my taste buds. I've seen descriptions of sweet and tangy, maybe a little spicy, a bit nutty with notes of butterscotch. That's a common description. I did see one describing it as musky, and I brewed some maca tea to try again, and I can see some of those elements. There is some sweetness and some tang, but to me, every time I taste it, there is a distinct note of, well, yeah, still there, of cigarette smoke. I mean, I say this as someone who's never smoked before, so take that for what it's worth, but it has the smell of cigarettes, and it tastes like it smells. It's a bit less noticeable in the tea here than, say, just eating it straight. But now, I did find one other random comment on a blog saying it tasted like tobacco to them, so I'm not the only one. I did find a few people commenting that it tasted like spoiled peanut butter to them, which I definitely don't see, but at least I know I'm not the only one finding it odd. Unlike the last one on this list, which I couldn't find anyone who agreed with me there. I don't know. Maybe this will grow on me if I try it a few more times. Any of you who have tried maca, how does it taste to you? Am I just crazy here? Anyway, not my first choice, nor even likely my third choice of beverages to wake up to, but I can understand why, even if the flavor isn't immediately appealing, how it could be acquired as a taste if it is as beneficial to health and survival as it purports to be. And maybe I would enjoy it more as a vegetable. I don't know. It is an interesting crop, and we'll see where the research ends up leading. Now, if you're looking at the purported medicinal effects of this one and you're thinking, well, shoot, my farm animals have got the opposite problem. Well, maybe this next one will be for you then. This one may look almost exactly like oca from earlier, but let me tell you, it is different. Different plant, different flavor, different reputation, different family. This is Mashua. Gardeners may recognize that this is actually a type of nasturtium. Similar flowers to the garden nasturtium, and you can eat the flowers and leaves just the same. Similar spicy flavor. Quite a nice looking plant, but this one also happens to produce tubers. Now, the reputation for this one is a bit mixed. It has a lot of good things going for it as a crop. It's easy to cook, incredibly productive, produces a bunch of chemicals that fight off nematodes, bacterial diseases, and insects that make it useful to plant together with other crops. It may not be quite as hardy as maca, but it can be grown up to 4,300 meters elevation, including some of the really steep, rocky, windy areas with really shallow soil. Of the Andean tubers, it's seen as one of the easiest, most productive, most nutritious, most hands-off, most cold-resistant roots, able to produce around 30 tons per hectare without much management. And good and nutritious as a cheap, rugged livestock feed grown from Argentina all the way up to Venezuela to some extent. And yet, well, in some ways it was highly valued. In other ways, it was not. It had a distinct reputation as a poverty food, something you didn't eat if you could afford not to. Why would that be? The arbitrary whims of fashion, the fact that it was associated with poor indigenous farmers after the Spanish came. Those were part of it, just like they were for some of the other Andean crops, but this time there were also some more practical reasons. So maybe your first guess would be to suggest, reasonably so, that, well, they're easy to grow and all, but maybe they don't taste as good. And that could touch on one of the reasons. More so than the other roots, I can certainly see why this one's taste would be divisive. If eaten raw, at least. If you've tasted nasturtiums, you might have a guess that these are spicy. Spicy, kind of like a radish, but a bit of a strange radish. Oh. That is interesting. Okay. Different varieties will vary in flavor a lot, and I tried 5 types, I think, but the thing that surprised me was that some of them tasted like radish mixed with sweet licorice. That may sound off-putting, but in all honesty to me, eating this raw, of all the vegetables on this list, it was by far my favorite. I'm kind of a sucker for radish or mustard sort of spiciness. And so to combine it with this unexpected sweetness, it exposed me to a combination I never would have thought to try. And I actually really enjoyed it. And I mean, compared to maca, I would take spicy licorice flavored radishes over sweetened roasted cigarettes any day. Mashua, where have you been all my life? That is a good vegetable right there. Now, not all of them taste this way, and when you cook them, the flavor mellows out a lot, and the spiciness and licorice flavors disappear, and you're left with something similar to a potato, maybe a bit more nutty, a bit more slippery and mushable texture than potatoes. I thought pretty pleasant and inoffensive. Some places note strong cabbage or Brussels sprout sorts of flavors. I didn't detect those, but apparently can happen. But roasted or boiled like this, they can be put in soups or stews. Again, sometimes they freeze dry them into a product like chuño. In some places, they also coat them in molasses and eat them as a sweet. I tried that, but I don't know. It just made me think of baked potatoes with molasses. I mean, it worked, and maybe I'm just not used to desserts having that sort of texture. But then I went back and tried the raw ones with molasses. Ooh, that is nice. Okay. Ooh. I like that. That is a little strange, but I like it. Good memories. Now, if the flavor was the only point of controversy with these, it would be fairly easily solved. There are milder flavored varieties, especially when cooked. But there's another big marketing hurdle here. Historically, mashua was seen as a vegetable for women and children, and not men, with one notable exception. The chronicler Bernabe Kobo notes that the Inca emperors were said to feed mashua to their soldiers, quote, so that they should forget their wives. Yeah. And this wasn't a lotus eater sort of forgetting. Traditionally, mashua was seen as an anti-aphrodisiac, something that decreases romantic desire and potentially fertility. So men didn't want to eat mashua because they were worried that their child-producing abilities would be hampered. And unfortunately, research has sort of backed this up. Notably, one study where rats were fed on a diet of mashua and researchers noted a 45% drop in their testosterone and DHT levels. Could this be changed through processing or cooking? Not sure. It's been linked to the isothiocyanates that also give it its spicy flavor, and it does get less spicy on cooking, so maybe? I couldn't find any concrete information on that, though. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that effect is from eating a substantial amount of mashua. Eating a few now and again, you'll be fine. I mean, I ate, like 5 roots about that big, and then I had a child. Interestingly, though, conversely, it seems it may actually have a bit of the opposite effect for women, potentially a positive effect on fertility. It is a bummer, though. A bit of a pickle. It's understandable why some people would be reluctant to eat much mashua, but for those for whom that isn't a worry, it makes for a really good crop on almost every count. Maybe more research could be put into finding varieties that have less of these chemicals, or maybe different ways of processing. Understandably, mashua hasn't received as much advocacy for reducing that day-length sensitivity and spreading as an international crop. Apparently, some was actually successfully grown here in Canada, in Vancouver. Now, compared to here in the prairies, that's still practically tropical. But in any case, definitely still an interesting crop, if for nothing else as an ornamental and occasional snack. But darn if it ain't one of the tastiest vegetables I've ever eaten. Now, there are other Andean root crops I didn't get to try in my time in Peru, but as a bonus for this video, I had to include this fruit here. It didn't really fit in any of my other videos, and hey, the texture is kind of like a root vegetable. This is lucuma, one of the most popular fruits in the Andes, used in everything from ice creams to puddings, milkshakes, cakes, yogurt, popular past and present, once again depicted in ancient moche pottery. But despite all that, if you haven't been to the Andes, or maybe a small handful of other places, good chance you've never heard of it. It's got kind of finicky growing requirements that make it good in the highlands and parts of the desert coasts, but not areas that get too hot or humid. Limits the options for spreading. But it is an interesting fruit. You can definitely tell it's a close relative of egg fruit if you've seen those before. Similar look and texture of the fruit. Here, kind of like firm boiled egg yolks mixed with creamy, pasty mashed potatoes. Texture only, not flavor. But it's interesting as a fruit that isn't often eaten straight. That texture means it works well dried and ground into a flour, and you can often find it frozen as a paste like I did here. But the flavor. Here, again, I diverge. I checked a lot of descriptions. I checked forums, I checked Weird Explorer's taste test of it. The descriptions you'll read often include comparisons to things like sweet potato, butterscotch, and maple syrup. I can kind of see all those things, but the one thing that none of them seem to mention that I just can't escape: Well, when I taste it, I taste a mixture of sweet potato, butterscotch, bit of maple syrup, and cigarettes. Or maca, again, if you want. I'm sorry to any Andean folks watching. I don't know what's with my taste buds. I told a Peruvian friend that lucuma tasted to me like it had an edge of cigarettes, and he looked at me like I'd insulted his mother. I have not found a single person who agrees with me on this. Couldn't find anyone saying this online. I mean, they did tell me you don't usually eat this straight. And so I thought, okay, sure. And maybe that particular lucuma, someone was just smoking next to it at the market or when they picked it. So I tried more. I tried it in yogurt. I tried it in ice cream. I tried it frozen like I have here. And yeah, every time, like it was more subtle in those ones where there's the added sweetness, but still, I don't know. Is this just some sort of genetic thing, like how different people taste cilantro differently? If any of you have tried lucuma here, please just let me know. Am I way off base here or something? The weird part, though, for me, is I actually kind of enjoy this one. I think that ice cream and the yogurt, the cigarette flavor actually kind of blended well. I don't know. It was a confusing experience. Kind of like when you listen to a piece of music where the harmonies are just a little bit off, but then the longer you listen to it, it gets harder to tell if it's just poorly harmonized or funky in a strangely pleasing way. It's lucuma, it kind of grew on me, I think. I don't know. Rest assured, if you try it, you'll probably enjoy it. Most people do, apparently. And if you're a smoker, maybe you'll enjoy it more. Anyway, there's quite a number of other Andean crops out there, including at least 4 more root vegetables and plenty of fruits. But this almost finishes off the ones I was able to try in my brief time in Peru. If there's others you would recommend that I didn't cover, or if you maybe had experiences where how you tasted something didn't match how most people taste it, let me know in the comments. As always, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. And if you would like to support me further, you can find me on Patreon or YouTube memberships. And for more plants, weird and wonderful, mundane and strange, I'll see you in the next one on Ambling with Sam.